They didn't understand what broke inside a human when you took the one person who made them gentle. The lights of Varkos Arena flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting long shadows across the black sand that had swallowed 1,000 stories before this one ever began, and high above in the towering tiers of alloy and glass. The crowd waited in a silence that felt heavier than any roar, because something had already happened here, something the records would never fully explain, and at the center of it all stood Avery Walker, motionless, her boots half buried in the fine grit, her breathing slow, controlled, almost calm, as if she were standing in an empty training room instead of the most feared arena in the Orion Fringe, and in her hand, barely visible beneath the harsh white spotlight, was a small piece of metal no larger than a dog tag, scratched, bent, and worn from years of use, a simple academy insignia that belonged to someone who wasn't standing beside her anymore, someone who should have been, someone who had always been, because before the arena, before the chains and the Watchers and the endless cycle of force matches, there had been two of them, and that had made all the difference. It had started months earlier, in a place that felt like another universe entirely, where the floors were polished and the air smelled like antiseptic and coffee instead of ozone and metal, where Avery Walker and Emily Carter wore the same Navy cadet uniforms and argued over navigation charts instead of survival odds, where Emily laughed too easily and Avery almost never did, and somehow that had worked, because Emily filled the silence Avery carried like armor, and Avery made sure nothing ever reached Emily that could hurt her, not on the training fields, not in zero-gravity drills, not even in the quiet spaces between missions where doubt liked to creep in, and the instructors had written them off as an uneven pair, one too soft, the other too cold, but they didn't see what mattered. They didn't see the way Emily's voice could steady Avery's pulse, or how Avery's presence turned every room into something safer. And maybe that was the first mistake the galaxy would keep making, mistaking connection for weakness, because out here, beyond the reach of Earth, empathy wasn't respected. It was studied, measured, and eventually exploited. The mission that took them beyond the Orion boundary had been routine, at least on paper, a simple reconnaissance sweep with standard parameters and predictable risks, the kind of assignment that cadets used to prove they were ready for more. And for the first few hours, it had been exactly that, until it wasn't, until the sensors went dark for half a second too long and the stars outside their cockpit shifted just enough to signal something was wrong. And by the time Avery realized what they were flying into, it was already too late to turn back, too late to warn anyone, too late to avoid the net that wrapped around their ship like a living thing and dragged them out of the sky without a sound. When they woke up, the air was different, heavier, recycled, carrying the faint tang of machinery, and something else beneath it, something older, something that didn't belong in any place meant for people, and the walls around them weren't human-made. Not in the way Avery understood construction. They curved in unnatural ways, layered with materials that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. And the only thing that felt real was the chain locked around her wrist and the quiet presence of Emily sitting across from her, still there, still breathing, still trying to smile, even though her hands trembled just enough for Avery to notice. And that was when Avery understood the situation in a way no briefing ever could, because survival wasn't going to be about getting out. Not yet. It was going to be about keeping Emily safe in a place designed to take everything apart piece by piece. They learned the name of the place hours later, not from a formal introduction, but from the way the guard said it, with a kind of pride that didn't belong to anything good. Varkos Arena, a word that echoed through corridors and screens and announcements, always followed by the same expectation, that everything brought here would eventually be broken down into something entertaining, something profitable, something disposable. And the first time Avery was taken out into the open, led by silent figures in armor that didn't quite match any known design, she saw the scale of it, the endless tiers of watchers, the shifting lights, the sand that had been disturbed too many times to ever settle completely, and she felt Emily's absence behind her like a physical weight, like a piece of gravity that had been ripped away, and somewhere above, hidden behind layers of glass and shadow, someone was watching closely, someone who believed they already understood exactly how this would play out, because to them, this wasn't a story about survival. It was a demonstration, a simple equation: take the bond, apply pressure, observe the result, and what they expected to see was a human breaking point. What they didn't know yet was that Avery Walker didn't break the way they thought she would. The first night inside Varkos did not begin with chaos or shouting. It began with observation, with quiet eyes watching from behind reinforced glass as new arrivals were processed like inventory, measured not by who they were, but by what they could become. And Avery Walker stood perfectly still while the restraints around her wrists adjusted to her movement. Not tight enough to restrict her completely, but firm enough to remind her that every step was being controlled. And across the chamber, Emily Carter was already being assessed by a cluster of hovering drones, their soft mechanical hum filling the silence as they scanned her vitals and projected data streams into the air. And even from a distance, Avery could read the shift in the guard's posture, the subtle recalculation that always followed when they realized Emily was not a fighter, that she was something else, something they could use. And that realization settled into Avery like a weight she did not show, because reacting too early would only confirm what they expected. And what they expected was simple. They expected attachment to create weakness. Hours passed in cycles that felt deliberately stretched, the lighting never fully dimming, the air never fully still, and when they were finally moved again, it was not together. And that was the first true fracture in the rhythm they had always shared, because for years Avery and Emily had operated as a single unit, not by design, but by instinct. And now the separation was intentional, calculated, designed to isolate variables in a controlled environment. And as Avery was guided through a narrow corridor lined with reflective panels, she caught one last glimpse of Emily being taken in the opposite direction. Her expression steady, but her fingers tightening around the sleeve of her uniform for just a second, longer than usual. And that small detail, that almost invisible hesitation, was enough to tell Avery everything she needed to know. Emily was afraid, and she was hiding it, just like she always did when she did not want Avery to worry, and that only made it worse. The chamber they placed Avery in was circular, about 20 feet across, with a floor that felt slightly unstable under her boots, as if it could shift at any moment. And above her, the ceiling opened into a vast dome, where silhouettes moved behind layers of tinted glass. Observers who never spoke directly, but whose presence pressed down like gravity. And when the restraints disengaged, Avery did not move immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the watchers think she was uncertain, because uncertainty was something they understood. It fit into their models. It made her predictable, and predictability was something she could use later, but inside her mind the calculations had already begun, mapping distances, tracking movement patterns, measuring response times from the drones that hovered just out of reach, because this was not a random environment. It was a system, and systems could be learned. The first test was not announced with words, only with a shift in lighting and a subtle change in the air pressure that made the hairs on Avery's arms stand on end, and then the floor beneath her feet separated into segments, revealing mechanical structures beneath that rose slowly into position, not attacking, not yet, just presenting themselves, forcing a reaction, and Avery gave them one, but not the one they expected. She moved carefully, deliberately, avoiding direct confrontation, using minimal force, ending the sequence quickly without escalation. And when it was over, the drones recorded everything, every movement, every hesitation, every choice, and somewhere above the observers adjusted their expectations, marking her as capable but restrained, dangerous but controlled. And that was exactly what Avery wanted them to believe. When they returned her to a holding area later, she found Emily already there, seated on a narrow bench with a small device partially concealed in her hands, something improvised from fragments of broken equipment. And for a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the arena, not the watchers, just the fact that Emily was still here, still breathing, still trying to fix things even in a place that was designed to break them. And Avery stepped closer, lowering her voice as she spoke, asking quietly if she was all right. And Emily nodded with that same steady expression, the one that said she was holding on even when the situation did not justify it. And then she leaned in slightly and whispered that she had found a way to access a maintenance channel, that she might be able to send a signal if she had more time. And for the first time since they had been taken, something shifted in Avery's chest. Not relief, not yet, but the outline of a possibility, a path that did not end here. And she nodded once, understanding without needing more words, because they had always been able to communicate like that, in small signals, in shared trust. And as the guards signaled for them to separate again, Avery allowed herself one final look at Emily, memorizing the details, the way the dim light caught in her hair, the way her shoulders stayed squared despite everything. And then she turned away without hesitation, because hesitation was something the arena would notice, and she was not going to give it anything it could use. Not yet, not until she understood exactly how far this place was willing to go to prove its point. By the third cycle inside Varkos Arena, Avery Walker understood something the observers above her still did not. This place was not designed to test strength. It was designed to study reaction, to map behavior under pressure, to reduce every individual into a predictable pattern that could be controlled. And that realization settled into her mind with a clarity that sharpened everything else, because if the arena needed patterns, then the only way to survive was to deny it one, to become something it could not easily define, and that meant restraint where they expected aggression, silence where they expected fear, and patience where they expected desperation. The tests continued, each one slightly different, each one pushing in a new direction, sometimes speed, sometimes endurance, sometimes decision-making under shifting conditions, and Avery moved through all of them with the same control precision, never exceeding what was necessary, never revealing more than she had to, and each time she finished, the drones recorded her data with quiet efficiency, feeding it into a system that believed it was learning her limits, but Avery was doing the same. In return, tracking the timing between phases, the delay in environmental changes, the exact moment the observers reacted to unexpected variables, and slowly, piece by piece, the arena stopped feeling like an unknown and started feeling like something that could be broken down into components. But the arena was not the only thing adapting, because somewhere above the glass, someone else had started to take a more direct interest, someone who was no longer satisfied with passive observation, and Avery felt that shift before she ever saw it, in the way the guards moved with more intent, in the way the drones lingered a fraction longer than before, in the subtle tightening of control that signaled a new phase had begun. When she was brought back to the holding area again, Emily was already waiting, her posture more tense than before, her hands no longer steady as she worked on the small device she had been building from salvage components. And when Avery approached, Emily looked up with a quick, searching glance that carried both urgency and determination. And this time she did not wait for a quiet moment to speak. She leaned in immediately and told Avery that the maintenance channel was real, that she had access to fragment of the arena's internal network, that she could almost reach an external relay if she had just a little more time. And the way she said it made it clear this was not just hope. It was a plan, a fragile one, but real enough to matter. Avery listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but inside her mind the calculations shifted again, because this changed the objective. Survival was no longer the only goal. Now, there was a possibility of escape, and that meant the arena would respond differently if it detected the attempt, and that meant the margin for error had just narrowed significantly. Before Avery could respond, the guards entered again, but this time there was something different about the way they positioned themselves, less routine, more deliberate. And for a brief moment the room fell into a silence that felt intentional, like a pause before something important. And then a new presence appeared, not physically at first, but as a projection, a figure forming in the air above them, composed of light and shadow, tall, composed, and unmistakably in control, and even without an introduction, Avery knew this was the one who had been watching more closely than the others, the one who had been adjusting the parameters behind the scenes. The figure regarded them with a calm that felt calculated, and when it finally spoke, the voice was smooth, measured, carrying a confidence that came from absolute certainty in its own conclusions, and it addressed Avery directly, acknowledging her performance, noting her restraint, her efficiency, her refusal to escalate beyond necessity, and then it shifted its attention briefly to Emily, not with interest, but with assessment, as if confirming a variable that had already been categorized. And in that moment, Avery understood exactly how they saw this situation. Emily was not a person in their system. She was leverage. The figure explained, in terms that sounded almost academic, that the arena thrived on understanding the limits of its participants, that every individual had a threshold, a point at which control could be established, and it expressed curiosity about where Avery's threshold might be, because so far she had not revealed it. And then it made a decision, one that did not need to be explained in detail for Avery to understand its meaning. The next phase would not test her directly, it would test what she valued. And with that, the projection faded, leaving the room colder than before, not in temperature, but in implication. The guards moved in immediately after, separating Avery and Emily again, but this time the separation felt final in a way the others had not, because it was no longer about processing or routine, it was about preparation. And as Emily was led away, she managed one last glance back, her expression steady despite the tension in her shoulders, and Avery held that look for exactly 1 second before turning away. Not because she did not care, but because she understood something now that the arena did not. They believed they were about to find her breaking point, but they had already made the mistake that would cost them everything. They had assumed that the only thing a human would do when something important was threatened was fall apart, and they had not considered the possibility that it might do the opposite. The next phase did not begin with noise or spectacle. It began with absence, with a silence that stretched longer than any cycle before, and Avery Walker stood alone in a holding chamber that felt deliberately stripped of distraction. No drones hovering close, no shifting lights, no subtle environmental tests, just a single overhead beam casting a narrow circle onto the floor as if marking a stage that had not yet been filled. And for the first time since arriving at Varkos Arena, the system gave her nothing to react to, which in itself was a signal, because systems like this did not create emptiness without purpose. And Avery understood immediately that this was not a pause. It was pressure, the kind designed to make the mind fill in the gaps, to create uncertainty where none had been provided. But she did not pace, did not speak, did not attempt to provoke a response. She simply waited, conserving energy, keeping her breathing steady, refusing to let the arena dictate the rhythm of her thoughts. Time passed in measured increments. She tracked without a clock, counting breaths, mapping the subtle changes in airflow that hinted at hidden mechanisms adjusting around her. And when the doors finally opened, the shift was immediate, the controlled stillness replaced by motion and sound as guards moved with a level of coordination that signaled something significant was about to occur. And this time they did not restrain her in the same way. They guided her, almost carefully, as if the integrity of what came next required precision rather than force. And as Avery stepped into the corridor, she noticed something new, the faint echo of distant voices, not commands or mechanical tones, but a low, collective murmur that carried the weight of anticipation, and she recognized it for what it was, the audience. The path opened into the main arena, but not in the way she had seen it before. Not from the perspective of a participant entering a test, but from a controlled approach that allowed her to see the scale fully, the vast expanse of black sand stretching out under layered lighting systems. The towering tiers filled with observers whose forms blurred together into a shifting mass. And above them all, the transparent barriers separating the spectacle from those who believed themselves untouchable. And for a brief moment, the entire structure felt less like a place and more like a statement, a declaration of power built on the assumption that everything brought here could be reduced to entertainment. Avery was positioned at the edge of the arena floor, not released immediately, not yet. And as she stood there, the lighting shifted again, focusing not on her, but on the opposite side of the field. And that was when she saw Emily Carter. She was standing within a marked zone, her posture steady but unmistakably strained, her hands empty, her expression composed in the way Avery recognized as deliberate, a mask held in place for someone else's sake. And for a fraction of a second, The world narrowed to that single point, to the distance between them, to the realization that this was no longer theoretical, no longer a possibility to prepare for. This was the moment the arena had been building toward since the beginning. The crowd's murmur intensified, not with cruelty, but with expectation, as if they were about to witness the confirmation of a theory. And somewhere above, hidden among the layers of glass and shadow, the controlling presence watched with focused intent, ready to record every reaction, every deviation from predicted behavior. A voice resonated through the structure then, amplified and controlled, not loud enough to startle, but clear enough to command attention, and it spoke in measured tones about variables and thresholds, about the nature of attachment and its impact on performance, framing the situation not as an act of cruelty, but as an experiment, a demonstration of principles that had been observed across countless species. And as it spoke, the distance between Avery and Emily felt like more than physical space. It became a boundary defined by expectation, by the belief that what came next would follow a predictable pattern. Emily did not call out, did not break her composure, but when her eyes met Avery's across the arena, there was a message there, unspoken but unmistakable, the same message she had carried since the academy, since the first time they had stood back to back in a training exercise and trusted each other without question. It said, hold the line. It said, do not give them what they want. It said, we are still us even here. And Avery absorbed that message without changing her expression, without giving the watchers above any indication of what it meant, because outwardly she remained exactly what they believed her to be: controlled, measured, contained. The restraints disengaged with a soft mechanical click, releasing her onto the arena floor, and still she did not move immediately. She let the moment extend, let the silence return just enough to unsettle the rhythm the arena had tried to establish. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in the environment, not in the crowd, but in the balance of understanding between observer and subject. Because while they believed they were about to witness the breaking of a human under pressure, Avery Walker had already reached a different conclusion. This was not a test of endurance. It was a miscalculation. And the system that had been built to analyze and control had just positioned its most critical variable directly at the center of its own structure, without realizing what that variable was truly capable of when the conditions were no longer aligned with expectation. The arena did not rush the moment forward. It stretched it, letting anticipation build like pressure inside a sealed chamber, and Avery Walker remained exactly where she stood, her boots pressed into the dark sand, her posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place given the scale of what surrounded her, while across the distance Emily Carter held her ground inside the marked zone, her shoulders squared despite the strain that Avery could see even from yards away, and between them the empty space felt like something deliberate, something designed to force movement, to provoke a reaction that the observers above could catalog and study. But Avery did not move, because movement now would mean playing into a pattern that had already been written for her. The voice that had spoken before returned, calmer now, almost instructional, as if addressing an audience eager to learn, and it explained that what they were about to witness was not punishment but demonstration, that across countless species the presence of a bonded individual created predictable outcomes under stress, that attachment reduced efficiency and introduced instability, and that the purpose of this phase was to confirm the threshold at which performance degraded into emotional compromise. And as the words echoed through the structure, the crowd leaned into the narrative, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity, because to them this was data made visible, theory translated into reality. Avery listened without reacting, her attention fixed not on the voice, but on the environment itself, on the subtle shifts in lighting, on the faint hum beneath the sand that indicated active systems waiting to engage, on the positioning of the drones along the perimeter, and most importantly on the pathways between her and Emily, because distance in a place like this was never just physical, it was controlled, adjustable, something that could be manipulated at any moment to alter the outcome, and she needed to understand exactly how much of it was real and how much of it could be changed. Emily shifted slightly then, just enough for Avery to notice, her weight adjusting as if bracing for something unseen. And for a moment her composure slipped, not outwardly, but in the smallest detail, the way her hand tightened at her side before she steadied it again. And that was enough to confirm what Avery already suspected. Whatever came next would not be passive. It would force a decision, it would demand action, and it would be time to capture the exact point where control broke down. And the arena believed that moment was inevitable. A low tone sounded, not loud, but precise, and the markings on the arena floor illuminated in faint lines that traced out boundaries and pathways, reshaping the space between them into something structured, something that suggested direction without forcing it, and the drones adjusted their positions in response, forming a loose perimeter that guided movement without directly blocking it, and the message was clear without needing words. The system was creating a scenario, one that would unfold, based on choice, one that would reveal what it needed to see. Avery finally took a step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but measured, and the moment she did, the arena responded, the floor shifting slightly beneath her as if acknowledging the input, and the crowd's murmur rose just enough to mark the change. But Avery did not accelerate. She did not run toward Emily the way the system expected. She maintained a steady pace, her eyes scanning the environment, tracking the response time of the drones, the delay between her movement and the systems. Adjustment, because even now, even in this moment, she was still learning, still mapping, still refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Across the field, Emily met her gaze again, and this time there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not exactly, but urgency, the kind that came from understanding the stakes at a level deeper than the observers ever would. And she gave a slight shake of her head, almost imperceptible, a silent warning, a reminder of the plan she had been working on, the signal she had nearly completed, the possibility that still existed if they did not let the arena force them into its narrative. And Avery understood that too. Understood that rushing forward could destroy more than just a moment. It could end the only chance they had to get out of here. And so she adjusted again, slowing just slightly, changing her angle, making it look like hesitation instead of calculation. Above them, the observers shifted, not physically, but in attention, because something about this was not aligning with their projections. The expected escalation was not happening. The emotional spike they had predicted was not manifesting in the way they had modeled. And that discrepancy drew focus, drew analysis, drew a closer examination of every movement Avery made. And that was when the system changed its approach. The lighting intensified suddenly around Emily's position, isolating her in a brighter field that made her stand out against the darker expanse of the arena, and the tone in the air shifted with it, becoming sharper, more insistent, and the voice returned once more, no longer purely observational, but directive, stating that the demonstration required a clearer stimulus, that the variable needed to be engaged more directly. And even without explicit detail, the implication was unmistakable. The arena was escalating, adjusting the conditions to force the reaction it had not yet received. Avery stopped then, not because she was uncertain, but because she had reached the point where observation alone was no longer enough. And in that stillness, as the system prepared to push further, something changed inside her. Not outwardly, not in a way the watchers could immediately quantify, but in a deeper, more fundamental sense, because the arena believed it was about to define her limits. But Avery Walker had just realized that the only way to protect what mattered now was not to play within those limits at all. The arena did not wait long after Avery Walker stopped moving, because systems like this were built to respond to resistance, not respect it, and the moment her stillness disrupted the expected flow, the environment shifted again with a precision that revealed just how closely every action was being monitored. The light around Emily Carter intensified further until it bordered on isolating her completely from the rest of the arena, turning her into a focal point not just for Avery, but for every observer watching from above. And the low hum beneath the sand deepened into something more active, more deliberate, as if the structure itself was preparing to enforce. The outcome it had already decided was inevitable. The voice returned, but now it carried a subtle change in tone. No longer purely analytical, but edged with something closer to insistence, explaining that when variables did not respond within expected parameters, additional stimuli were required to achieve clarity, and that the purpose of this phase was not to create harm, but to reveal truth, to strip away restraint and expose the underlying nature of the subject being observed. And as it spoke, the drones adjusted again, tightening their formation around Emily's position, not touching, not interfering directly, but creating a controlled pressure that narrowed her space, that forced her awareness inward, that made the situation unmistakably real. Avery saw all of it in a single glance, not as separate details, but as a pattern unfolding exactly as the arena intended. And for the first time since stepping onto the sand, she allowed herself to fully process what that pattern meant, because this was no longer about testing her limits. It was about forcing her to reveal them. And the system had chosen the one variable it believed would guarantee a reaction, the one variable it believed she could not ignore. Emily did not speak, did not call out, but her posture changed again, a slight shift in balance that Avery recognized instantly from years of training together. It was the same adjustment Emily made before committing to something difficult, before choosing action over hesitation. And when their eyes met across the distance once more, the message was clearer than before. Not a warning this time, but a decision. She was going to continue her plan, no matter what the arena did, no matter how much pressure it applied. And that realization hit Avery with a clarity that cut through everything else, because it meant that any reaction she gave now would not just affect her. It would affect the timing, the fragile window Emily needed to complete what she had started. The crowd's murmur shifted again, not louder, but sharper, as if they were beginning to sense that something was not aligning with their expectations, that the narrative they had been presented with was not unfolding as cleanly as it should, and that tension fed back into the system, into the observers above who adjusted their models in real time, searching for the point where control would reassert itself, where the variables would fall back into predictable behavior. And when that point did not appear, they escalated again. A series of tones echoed through the arena, each one slightly higher in pitch than the last, creating a layered signal that vibrated through the air, and the ground beneath Avery's feet responded, shifting in subtle ways that altered her footing, that introduced instability without forcing it, while at the same time the space around Emily tightened further, the drones repositioning with mechanical precision to reduce her available movement. Not enough to trap her completely, but enough to increase the pressure, to push her closer to the threshold the system was trying to identify. Avery exhaled slowly, her breath steady despite the changes around her. And for a moment she closed her eyes, not in surrender, not in fear, but in focus, because everything she had learned up to this point was converging into a single conclusion. The arena was not just observing, it was adapting, and that meant it could be misled, it could be guided into responses that were not part of its original design. But doing that required timing, required precision, required her to act not as a subject within the system, but as something that could influence it from within. When she opened her eyes again, her posture had not changed. Her expression remained controlled, but something deeper had shifted, something the observers could not quantify because it did not manifest in obvious ways. And she took another step forward, this time slightly faster than before, enough to trigger a response from the system, enough to draw its attention. And as expected, the arena reacted, the drones along her path adjusting to intercept, the ground beneath her shifting to compensate, the entire structure responding to the change in input exactly as it had been designed to do. And Avery noted every detail, every fraction of a second, every adjustment in positioning, because this was what she needed, not dominance, not strength, but understanding. Across the field, Emily saw the change and held her position, trusting in something that had been built long before this place, something that did not rely on systems or calculations. And as the arena continued to escalate, convinced it was closing in on the breaking point it had been searching for, it failed to recognize the one thing that mattered most. The moment it believed it was forcing a reaction was the same moment Avery Walker had decided exactly how she was going to take control of everything it thought understood. The system believed it was tightening control, but in reality, it was narrowing its own options, and Avery Walker moved with that understanding, settling deeper into every step she took, because now the arena was no longer testing her, it was reacting to her. And that difference changed everything, turning a controlled environment into something that could be influenced from within, something that could be redirected if the right inputs were applied at the right time. The drones shifted again as she advanced, their formation adjusting in smooth, calculated arcs designed to anticipate her path, and the ground beneath her feet responded in kind, subtle shifts altering her footing just enough to test balance and reaction. But Avery did not resist these changes, she flowed with them, allowing the system to believe it was guiding her movement while in reality, she was measuring its response patterns, counting the delay between input and adjustment, mapping the invisible boundaries that defined how far the arena could push before it had to stabilize again. Across the field, Emily Carter remained within the illuminated zone, her posture steady despite the increasing pressure, and though the watchers above could not see it clearly, Avery recognized the rhythm of her movements, the small, deliberate adjustments of her hands, the way her shoulders angled just slightly as if shielding something from view. And in that pattern Avery found confirmation. Emily was still working, still pushing forward with her plan, and every second that Avery could hold the arena's focus away from her was a second. That mattered. The voice returned once more, but now it carried a sharper edge, not anger, but a refinement of intent, as if the system was narrowing its hypothesis, stating that the subject was exhibiting controlled deviation, that expected emotional escalation had not yet been achieved, and that additional pressure would be applied to reach the necessary threshold. And as it spoke, the environment responded immediately, the lighting intensifying not just around Emily, but along the pathways between them, creating a clearer line of movement, a more direct route that subtly encouraged Avery to close the distance faster, to abandon restraint and act on instinct. Avery recognized the shift for what it was, a funnel, a narrowing of options designed to produce a single outcome. And instead of resisting it directly, she adjusted her pace again, not slowing this time, but accelerating just enough to trigger a stronger reaction from the system. And, as expected, the arena responded, the drones repositioning more aggressively, the ground shifting more noticeably, the entire structure increasing its level of engagement in response to her change in behavior. And, in that escalation, Avery found exactly what she needed: more data, more clarity, more insight into how far the system would go before it began to strain under its own complexity. The crowd's murmur rose in response to the increased activity, a subtle shift that carried through the structure like a wave, and somewhere above, the observers leaned closer, their attention sharpening as the scenario approached what they believed would be its defining moment, the point where the subject would either conform to expectation or break. Under pressure, and they were certain they knew which outcome was coming. Emily's gaze met Avery's again, and this time there was no hesitation, no warning, just trust, the kind that had been built over years of shared experience, the kind that did not need words to communicate intent. And Avery responded in kind, not with a nod or a gesture, but with a change so subtle it would go unnoticed by anyone not looking for it, a shift in timing, a slight alteration in the rhythm of her steps that aligned perfectly with the pattern Emily had been creating, and in that moment, the two of them were no longer reacting to the arena, they were moving within it on their own terms. The system did not recognize the coordination immediately, because it was not designed to account for variables that operated outside its predictive models. And that delay, that fraction of a second where the input did not match the expected output, created a gap, a small but critical opening in the otherwise seamless control the arena maintained, and Avery moved into that gap without hesitation. Her path no longer dictated by the illuminated lines on the floor, but by the invisible structure she had mapped in her mind, the one that revealed where the system was strongest and where it was not. The drones adjusted again, attempting to correct for the deviation, but their response was just slightly off, just enough for Avery to confirm what she had suspected. The more the system escalated, the more complex its reactions became, and the more complex its reactions became, the more room there was for error. And that was the flaw she had been waiting for, the one that would allow her to do more than survive, the one that would allow her to change the outcome entirely. Above them, the voice continued its analysis, unaware that the foundation of its conclusions was beginning to shift, stating that the subject was approaching the threshold, that the increase in activity indicated imminent emotional response. And the crowd responded with a collective anticipation, leaning into the moment they believed would confirm everything they had been told about human behavior. But they were watching the wrong thing, focusing on the visible escalation while missing the underlying change, the moment where control had already begun to slip. Avery took another step, then another, each one precise, each one calculated, and with every movement the arena responded, adjusting, compensating, attempting to maintain the balance it had been designed to enforce. But that balance was no longer stable, not in the way it had been at the beginning, because the system was now operating on incomplete information, reacting to patterns that no longer held true. And that instability, however slight, was enough. Across the field, Emily's hands moved once more, completing a sequence that Avery could not see in detail, but understood in purpose. And for a brief moment, something in the air shifted, not visibly, not in a way the observers immediately noticed, but in a deeper, structural sense, like a system receiving an input it had not been prepared for. And Avery felt it, not as a signal, but as a confirmation. The plan was reaching its critical point, and everything that happened next would determine whether they got out of this place or became another example in its endless cycle of observation and control. And as the arena continued to escalate, convinced it was forcing the final reaction it needed, Avery Walker was already moving toward a completely different conclusion, one the system had never been designed to handle. Something changed in the arena, not in the way the lights shifted or the drones adjusted, but deeper than that, in the invisible layer of control that held everything together. And Avery Walker felt it the same way a pilot feels turbulence before the instruments confirm it. A subtle instability, a delay where there should have been none, a hesitation in the system's response that did not belong in something built to be perfect. And she knew instantly that Emily Carter had done it, that somewhere behind the controlled movements and steady posture, Emily had reached the network she had been searching for and touched something the arena had not expected her to reach. The drones around Avery reacted first, not with aggression, but with confusion, their formation tightening and then loosening in a fraction of a second, as if receiving conflicting instructions, and the ground beneath her feet stuttered, not enough to throw her off balance, but enough to confirm that the system was recalibrating in real time, try to identify the source of the disruption, trying to correct something it did not yet understand. Above them, the observers shifted again, their attention sharpening as the data they were receiving no longer aligned with the inputs they were controlling, and the voice that had guided the demonstration paused for the first time since it began, not speaking, not explaining, just silent as it processed the anomaly. Avery did not hesitate, because hesitation now would waste the opening Emily had created, and instead she moved with a precision that had nothing to do with the arena's design and everything to do with the pattern she had built in her mind, stepping into the spaces where the drones had not yet corrected, moving along the paths where the ground had not fully stabilized, using the system's own recalibration delay against it. And for the first time since entering the arena, she was not reacting to its control, she was moving ahead of it. Across the field, Emily held her position, her hands still moving in small, deliberate motions that Avery could not see clearly but understood completely, because this was not just a disruption, it was a sequence, something that required timing, something that required the system to remain unstable just long enough for the next step to complete, and that meant Avery's role had shifted again, from observation to interference, from learning the system to actively preventing it from recovering too. Quickly, the crowd's murmur changed. No longer just anticipation, but confusion. A ripple of uncertainty moving through the tiers, as the smooth flow of the demonstration broke into something uneven, something unpredictable, and that uncertainty fed upward into the observers, into the controlling intelligence that had orchestrated everything so far. And when it finally spoke again, the tone had changed, the calm certainty replaced by a sharper, more focused intent, acknowledging the anomaly, identifying it as an external interference within the system, and initiating a containment protocol that would isolate the disruption and restore control. The arena responded immediately, the lighting shifting again, the pathways on the floor dissolving into a more chaotic pattern, the drones repositioning with greater urgency, no longer guiding, but attempting to restrict, and the space around Emily tightening further as the system tried to isolate her as the source of the interference. But it was already too late for a clean response, because the system was no longer operating with complete information, and every adjustment it made now was based on data that was already outdated. Avery increased her pace, not running, but moving with a controlled acceleration that kept her just ahead of the drones repositioning, using their delayed responses to create a path that should not have existed. And with each step she took, the system had to react, had to adjust, had to divert resources that would otherwise have been focused on isolating Emily. And that was the balance they needed, the fragile distribution of attention that kept the arena from fully locking down either of them. Above, the observers began to shift from analysis to intervention, their commands becoming more direct, more forceful, pushing the system to prioritize containment over observation. But that shift came with a cost, because the more aggressively the arena tried to regain control, the more complex its responses became, and the more complex its responses became, the more opportunities there were for error, for delay, for the kind of instability that Emily was already exploiting from within. The air itself seemed to change, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that had not been there before, a sign that something deeper in the system was being accessed, something beyond the visible controls of the arena floor. And Avery felt it as confirmation. The plan was not just disrupting the surface, it was reaching into the core of the structure, into the layer that governed everything else. Emily's movements slowed then, not because she was stopping, but because she was finishing, and when she finally looked up, meeting Avery's gaze across the shifting chaos of the arena, there was something different in her expression, not just determination, but completion, the quiet certainty that comes when a sequence reaches its final step. And in that moment, Avery understood that everything they had been working toward was about to converge, that the system was about to face something it had never been designed to handle. Not a subject breaking under pressure, but two variables acting in perfect coordination to rewrite the conditions of the experiment itself. And as the arena pushed harder, trying to close the gaps that were opening faster than it could respond, it failed to recognize the one truth that mattered most. It was no longer in control of the outcome. The system reached for control and found resistance instead, and that resistance did not come in the form it had been trained to expect, not panic, not chaos, but precision, coordinated and deliberate, unfolding faster than its models could adapt. And Avery Walker moved through the arena as if she had already seen every possible response before it happened, stepping into spaces that only existed for fractions of a second before the drones corrected their formation, shifting her weight just enough to avoid the instability in the ground before it fully manifested. And every movement she made forced the system to react again, to recalculate, to chase instead of lead, and that reversal, subtle at first, began to compound into something larger. Above them, the observers no longer leaned in with curiosity. They moved with urgency, issuing layered commands that overlapped and conflicted as they attempted to isolate the disruption and restore the arena to its intended state. But the more directives they issued, the more complex the system became. And the more complex it became, the less stable it was, because complexity without clarity did not create control. It created noise, and Emily Carter was already deep inside that noise. She had not stopped when she looked up before. She had only paused to confirm alignment. And now her hands resumed their motion, slower, more deliberate, as if completing a final sequence that required absolute precision. And though the arena could not see exactly what she was doing, it could feel the effect, a deeper instability spreading through its internal layers, a disruption not just of movement or positioning, but of timing itself, the synchronization that held everything together beginning to slip out of alignment. The voice returned again, sharper now, no longer explaining but commanding, initiating full containment protocols, redirecting system resources toward isolating the anomaly. But the problem was no longer where the anomaly was, it was how far it had spread, because every adjustment the arena made to contain Emily created new inconsistencies elsewhere, new delays, new gaps that Avery could exploit. And she did so without hesitation, accelerating again, not toward Emily directly, but along the edges of the system's response, forcing it to divide its attention even further. The crowd's murmur fractured into uneven waves, the rhythm of anticipation replaced by something uncertain, something that no longer followed the structure they had been given, and that uncertainty fed back into the observers, into the system, amplifying the instability rather than correcting it, because the arena had been built to demonstrate control, not to recover from losing it. Avery closed the distance in measured steps, each one calculated against the shifting patterns around her. And now the drones were no longer forming a clean perimeter. They were overlapping, correcting too quickly, creating brief moments where their coverage left small openings. And those openings were enough because Avery did not need a clear path. She only needed a series of imperfect ones, connected together by timing and intent. Emily's movements slowed again, then stopped completely. And for a moment she remained perfectly still, her hands resting at her sides as if she had done nothing at all. But Avery knew better, because the stillness carried a different weight this time. Not pause, not hesitation, but completion. And when Emily looked up again, there was no urgency left in her expression, only certainty. The arena reacted instantly to that stillness, interpreting it as a new variable, a potential shift in behavior. And the drones around her tightened once more, attempting to secure the position before any further deviation could occur. But this time the response came too late because the system they were relying on was no longer fully theirs. A low vibration moved through the structure, deeper than before, not just in the air or the ground, but in the underlying framework that supported the entire arena. And for the first time since the demonstration began, the lighting did not respond correctly, flickering in uneven intervals that broke the clean visual hierarchy the observers depended on, and that flicker spread, moving outward in waves that disrupted the synchronization of the drones, the pathways, the environmental controls. Everything that had once operated in perfect coordination, now operating just slightly out of step. Above, the observers issued new commands, more forceful, more direct, attempting to override the disruption and reassert control. But the system hesitated, not for long. Not enough to completely fail, but enough to confirm what Avery already understood. The arena was no longer responding instantly. It was thinking, processing, lagging, and in a place where timing was everything. That lag was fatal to its control. Avery took another step, then another. And now, there was nothing between her and Emily except distance, real distance, not controlled, not manipulated, just space that could be crossed. And as she moved, the arena tried to respond, tried to reestablish its patterns. But every attempt came just a fraction too late, every correction arriving after the moment it was needed. And that was all it took. The voice above faltered for the first time, cutting off mid-command as the system it relied on failed to execute in the expected sequence. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something the arena had never accounted for, a loss of certainty, a break in the assumption that everything within its walls could be predicted and controlled. And in that silence, Avery Walker reached the point where the system could no longer dictate what happened next, because the experiment it had designed was no longer operating under its rules. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, the kind of silence that comes when something foundational has shifted and no one is certain what happens next. And Avery Walker stood in the center of it with a clarity that cut through the confusion around her, Because while the arena struggled to reconcile what it was experiencing, she had already moved past the point of uncertainty. She was no longer navigating the system. She was operating outside of it. The distance between her and Emily Carter was no longer defined by controlled pathways or reactive barriers. It was simply space. And for the first time since they had been brought here, that space belonged to them, not to the arena, not to the observers above. And Avery crossed it without hesitation, her steps steady, her pace controlled, not rushing, not wasting movement, because this was not a moment of escape yet. It was a moment of transition, from being subjects of the system to becoming something it could not categorize. The drones attempted to respond as she moved, but their coordination was fractured, their timing off by just enough to make every adjustment ineffective, and instead of forming a coherent barrier, they created overlapping patterns that left gaps too large to ignore, and Avery moved through those gaps as if they had always been there, her path no longer reactive but intentional, guided by the understanding she had built piece by piece since the moment she entered the arena. Above, the observers issued commands in rapid succession, their voices overlapping, their instructions losing the clean structure they had maintained earlier, and the system responded with delays that grew more noticeable with each cycle, not failing completely, but no longer reliable, no longer immediate, and that loss of precision was enough to undermine everything they had built. When Avery reached Emily, she did not stop abruptly, did not create a moment of visible reunion that the watchers could interpret. She simply stepped into her space as if it had always been part of her path, and for a brief second, they stood side by side again, the way they had countless times before, and that simple alignment carried more weight than anything the arena had tried to force upon them, because it was not driven by pressure or reaction, it was chosen. Emily exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding longer than she realized, and though her hands were now still, the work she had done continued to ripple through the system around them, the instability she had introduced spreading deeper into the arena structure, affecting layers that the observers could not easily isolate or control. Avery turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge Emily without drawing unnecessary attention. And in that small movement, there was confirmation, not of survival, but of the next step, because neither of them believed this was over. Not yet. The arena was still active, still attempting to regain control, still dangerous in ways that were not immediately visible. But now they were no longer reacting to it blindly. They understood it, and that understanding changed everything. The lighting above flickered again, more erratically this time, breaking the clean visual hierarchy the observers relied on to maintain oversight, and the crowd's murmur shifted into something closer to unease, a low, uneven sound that reflected the loss of narrative they had been following. Because what they were witnessing no longer fit the structure they had been given. It was no longer a demonstration of predictable behavior. It was something else entirely, something unresolved. The voice that had guided the demonstration returned, but it was different now. No longer smooth, no longer certain, its tone carrying a trace of strain as it attempted to reassert control, issuing direct commands to stabilize the system, to isolate the disruption, to regain operational integrity. But the commands did not execute cleanly, each one encountering delays, inconsistencies, small failures that compounded into something larger, something that could not be corrected in real time. Avery observed all of it without reacting outwardly, her attention shifting from the immediate environment to the broader structure of the arena, the way the drones hesitated before moving, the way the floor no longer adjusted with perfect timing, the way the lighting failed to synchronize across different sections, and she understood what that meant. The system was no longer unified. It was fragmented, operating in pieces that were no longer perfectly aligned, and that fragmentation was not something it could easily recover from under pressure. Emily spoke then, quietly, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond their immediate space, but clear enough for Avery to hear, and she said that the network was not just disrupted, it was exposed, that the pathway she had access connected deeper into the arena's control systems than they had expected, and that meant they had more than just an opening, they had leverage, the ability to influence what the system did next if they acted quickly enough. Avery did not respond with words. She did not need to, because the plan was already forming, not fully defined yet, but taking shape in the same way everything else had since they arrived here, through observation, through adaptation, through the understanding that the arena's greatest strength had always been its control, and now the control was gone, replaced by something far more fragile, something that could be turned against itself. Around them, the arena continued to struggle, attempting to rebuild its structure, to re-establish its patterns, but every attempt came with a delay. Every correction arrived just a moment too late, and in that space between intention and execution, Avery Walker saw the opportunity they had been waiting for, not just to survive, not just to escape, but to end the experiment entirely, because the system that had been built to define them no longer had the ability to define anything at all. The realization settled in not as a sudden spark, but as a steady certainty that shaped every decision Avery Walker made next, because the arena was no longer something to escape from. It was something that could be turned, something that could be redirected using the very systems that had been designed to control it. And standing beside Emily Carter, she could feel that shift fully, the transition from reacting to planning, from surviving to executing. The instability around them continued to spread, subtle but undeniable, the drones hesitating before each adjustment, the lighting failing to synchronize across sections, the ground beneath their feet no longer responding with perfect precision, and every one of those inconsistencies pointed to the same truth: the system was no longer unified. It was fragmented into layers that were no longer communicating cleanly with one another. Emily moved first, not physically across the arena, but within the space she had already opened, her hands lifting again in controlled, deliberate motions as she re-engaged with the network she had accessed. And this time there was no urgency in her expression, only focus, the kind that came from understanding exactly what needed to be done and having just enough time to do it. Avery shifted her stance slightly, not to draw attention, but to position herself between Emily and the most active cluster of drones, not as a shield in the traditional sense, but as a variable the system would have to account for, something that would continue to divide its attention and prevent it from fully isolating Emily's actions. Above them, the observers pushed harder, their commands becoming more forceful, more direct, attempting to override the inconsistencies and force the arena back into a stable configuration. But each command encountered the same problem. The system responded, but not completely, not cleanly, and every partial response created new gaps, new delays, new points of failure that Emily could exploit from within. The voice that had once carried calm authority now spoke with clipped precision, issuing directives to reroute control pathways, to isolate corrupted segments, to re-establish synchronization across the arena's subsystems. But the more it tried to compartmentalize the problem, the more it revealed how deeply the disruption had spread, because there were no clean boundaries left to isolate. The instability was everywhere, woven into the structure of the system itself. Emily's fingers moved in a final sequence, slower than before, each motion deliberate, each one aligned with the timing of the system's delays, and as she completed it, the effect was immediate, not dramatic but fundamental. The underlying rhythm of the arena shifted, the slight delays becoming more pronounced, the coordination between drones breaking down further, the lighting losing any remaining synchronization, and for the first time, the arena did not just hesitate, it misaligned completely. Avery felt it in the way the space around them changed, not physically, but structurally, like a system trying to run multiple conflicting processes at once and failing to prioritize any of them correctly. And she understood that this was the moment they had been building toward, the point where the arena's control was not just weakened, but compromised at its core. She stepped forward again, not to close distance this time, but to test the system's response. And when the drones moved, they did so unevenly, some reacting too quickly, others too slowly, their formation breaking into something fragmented and ineffective. And that was all the confirmation she needed. Emily lowered her hands then, her work complete, and spoke quietly, her voice steady despite everything around them. explaining that she had not just disrupted the arena, she had gained access to its central routing layer, the part of the system that dictated how commands were distributed and executed, and that meant they could do more than just escape. They could decide what the arena did next. Avery turned slightly toward her, just enough to acknowledge the statement, and in that moment the plan solidified, not as a single action, but as a sequence, a chain of decisions that would push the system beyond its ability to recover. Above them, the observers were no longer analyzing. They were reacting, issuing rapid commands in an attempt to regain control. But their responses came too late, each one delayed, each one executed out of sequence, and the arena reflected that breakdown in real time, its movements becoming less coordinated, less controlled, more reactive, and less precise. The crowd's murmur shifted again, now carrying a clear edge of unease, because even without understanding the technical details, they could see that the demonstration had failed, that the structure they were watching was no longer behaving as it should, and that realization spread through the tiers like a quiet ripple of doubt. Avery took one more step, then stopped, not because she needed to, but because the next move would not be hers alone, and as she stood there beside Emily, in the center of a system that no longer held together the way it was supposed to, the final truth became clear. The arena had not just lost control of them. It had given them access to the one thing it could not afford to lose, the ability to define its own outcome. And what they chose to do with that would determine whether this place remained what it had always been or became something entirely different. The moment did not arrive with a surge of chaos or a dramatic shift in sound. It arrived with decision, quiet and absolute, and Avery Walker understood that everything they had done up to this point had led to this single point where hesitation would undo it all, because the arena was still trying to recover, still attempting to reassert control through fragmented commands and delayed responses, and if they waited too long, it would find a way to stabilize enough to contain them again, even if imperfectly. Emily Carter did not need to say it out loud. The understanding between them was already complete, and as she re-engaged with the system one final time, her hands moved with a level of precision that left no room for error, accessing the central routing layer she had described, not to disrupt it further, but to redirect it entirely. The arena responded immediately, but not in the way the observers expected, because instead of attempting to isolate the anomaly, the system began to shift its priorities, commands rerouting through pathways that no longer aligned with the directives being issued from above, and that misalignment created a cascade effect, one that spread faster than the observers could correct. The drones, once synchronized and precise, now received conflicting instructions, some attempting to tighten formation while others moved to disperse, creating patterns that overlapped and collapsed into inefficiency, and the lighting across the arena flickered in uneven waves that broke the visual structure the observers relied on to maintain oversight, turning clarity into confusion. Avery moved then, not reacting to the system, but acting within it, stepping forward with intent as the arena's fractured responses created openings that were no longer temporary, but sustained, and with each step she took, the system struggled to compensate, issuing corrections that arrived too late to matter. Above them, the observers' voices overlapped into something indistinct, no longer a coordinated command structure, but a collection of attempts to regain authority over a system that was slipping further out of reach with every passing second, and the voice that had once guided the demonstration now spoke in clipped, urgent tones, attempting to override the routing layer that Emily had accessed. But the commands failed to execute cleanly, each one encountering delays, rerouting through pathways that no longer obeyed a single source of control. Emily's final input triggered a deeper shift, one that moved beyond the visible elements of the arena and into the underlying systems that governed its operation. And the effect was immediate. The synchronization between subsystems broke down entirely, the arena no longer functioning as a unified structure, but as a collection of independent processes that could not align fast enough to restore order. The crowd reacted first, their murmur rising into something sharper, more unsettled, as the spectacle they had come to observe lost its coherence. the predictable flow of events dissolving into something uncertain and unstructured, and that uncertainty spread upward into the observers, into the control systems, into every layer of the arena that had once depended on precision and timing to function. Avery reached the center of the arena floor, not because it was a target, but because it was the point where the system's influence was most concentrated, and standing there, she turned her attention upward for the first time, not with defiance, not with anger, but with clarity, because the arena was no longer something that could define her. It was something that had already lost the ability to define anything at all. Emily stepped beside her, her movements steady despite the instability around them, and together they stood in a space that no longer belonged to the system that had created it, a space that had been reclaimed through understanding and coordination rather than force. The arena continued to attempt recovery, its systems cycling through commands, rerouting pathways, attempting to re-establish synchronization. But each attempt failed to align, each correction arriving too late, too incomplete, and with every failed cycle, the structure moved further from control and closer to collapse, not in a physical sense, but in the sense that it could no longer fulfill its purpose. It could no longer function as a system of observation and control. The voice above faltered again, cutting off mid-command as the routing layer failed to deliver the instruction in sequence, and the silence that followed was different from before, not heavy with anticipation, but hollow, the absence of authority where it had once been absolute. Avery did not need to speak, did not need to act further, because the outcome had already been decided the moment the system lost its ability to respond in time. And as the arena's processes continued to misalign, to fragment, to fail in small but compounding ways, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer a demonstration of control. It was the end of it, not through destruction, but through something far more fundamental, the loss of the one thing it had been built to maintain, the ability to dictate what happened next. The arena did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled, slowly at first, then all at once, and Avery Walker stood at its center as the system that had once controlled every movement around her lost its final hold on order. The drones drifting into incomplete formations, the lighting flickering without pattern, the pathways dissolving into meaningless fragments of what they had once been. And above it, all the observers no longer issued commands with authority. They reacted, their voices, layered with uncertainty as the structure beneath them refused to respond as it had before. Emily. Carter lowered her hands completely, stepping back from the invisible interface she had been manipulating, and for the first time since this began, there was nothing left for her to adjust, nothing left to redirect, because the system had reached a point where it could no longer process inputs in a meaningful way. It had lost the cohesion required to function, and what remained was not control, but noise. Avery took a slow breath, her posture still composed, her focus steady, not because the danger had vanished, but because she understood it differently now. The arena was no longer something that could dictate outcomes, but it was still a place built on systems that could fail unpredictably, and that meant their next move mattered just as much as everything that had come before. The crowd's murmur no longer carried curiosity or anticipation. It carried unease, a recognition that the demonstration they had come to witness had turned into something else entirely, something unresolved and beyond their expectations. And that unease spread through the structure like a signal, feeding back into the already fractured system and amplifying the instability. Above, the voice that had once framed everything as a controlled experiment tried to speak again, but the words did not carry the same weight. The timing of the broadcast faltered, the delivery breaking into uneven segments as the routing layer failed to deliver it cleanly. And for the first time, the arena's authority did not just weaken, it became uncertain. Avery turned her attention outward, not just to the space immediately around her, but to the larger structure of the arena, the access points, the pathways that connected it to whatever existed beyond these walls. And she understood that this was no longer about enduring the system. It was about leaving it behind, about moving from a place of containment to a place of choice, and that transition required clarity, not haste. Emily stepped closer, her voice low and steady as she explained that the routing layer was still accessible, that even though the system was fragmented, there were still pathways that could be used, exits that were no longer fully controlled. And that meant they had a window, not a perfect one, but a real one, to move beyond the arena before the observers found a way to regain even partial control. Avery nodded once, the motion small but decisive, and together they began to move, not toward the center, not toward any marked path, but toward the edges of the structure where the system's influence was weakest, where the fragmentation had created the largest gaps. And as they did, the arena attempted to respond, but its movements were no longer coordinated, the drones drifting without purpose, the ground shifting in ways that no longer aligned with any clear objective, and the entire structure felt less like a controlled environment and more like something searching for stability it could no longer find. The observers above reacted to their movement, issuing new commands, attempting to redirect what remained of the system toward containment. But the responses came too late, too fragmented, and every attempt to reassert control only highlighted how much of it had already been lost. The crowd watched in a silence that no longer held expectation, but realization, because even without understanding the technical details, they could see the outcome. The system that had once defined everything within its walls could no longer do so, and the two figures moving across the arena floor were no longer subjects within it. They were leaving it behind. As Avery and Emily reached the boundary where the arena connected to its outer corridors, the lighting above them flickered one final time, not as a dramatic signal, but as a fading echo of the control that had once been absolute, and beyond that threshold, the space opened into something different, something not governed by the same fractured system. And for the first time since they had been taken, the path ahead was not defined by the arena's design, but by their own decisions. Avery paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping through. Not to look back, not to acknowledge what had been left behind, but to confirm something within herself, something that had been tested, challenged, and ultimately clarified by everything that had happened here. That what made them human was never the weakness the arena believed it to be. It was the reason they had made it this far. The reason the system had failed to contain them, and the reason it would never fully understand what it had tried to measure. And as they moved forward into the unknown beyond the arena, leaving behind a structure that could no longer fulfill its purpose, the truth settled into the silence that followed. The experiment had not just failed, it had been rewritten, and in doing so, it had changed the very thing it had been trying to define.